Hey there, deep divers. Ready to dive into another pretty heavy topic.
Always ready.
All right, so today we're tackling something that's been all over the headlines lately,
Yeah.
and it's a big one. 2024 just went down as the hottest year ever recorded,
Yeah.
officially exceeding that 1.5 degrees Celsius mark set by the Paris Agreement.
Big deal.
It is a big deal.
Right.
So we're going to unpack what this really means, the causes, the consequences, and maybe take a look at what the future might hold for all of us.
Yeah, sounds good. I think it's important to, when we talk about this 1.5 degree mark, to remember that it's not just some random number
Right.
that scientists came up with. Exceeding it, even for a single year, is a big red flag.
Yeah, for sure.
The Paris Agreement, they highlighted this threshold because scientists have shown that going beyond that 1.5 degrees significantly increases the risk of really severe climate impacts.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So we're calling more frequent and more intense heat waves, droughts, floods, storms, all kinds of things that can disrupt pretty much everything you can think of: agriculture, infrastructure, human health, the whole nine yards.
Right. And the Paris Agreement was adopted way back in 2015, but it brought together almost 200 countries.
It's amazing.
Aiming to keep global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius.
Mm.
And ideally, limited to 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels.
Mm-hmm.
But this recent temperature spike really raises the question, what exactly pushed us over that edge in 2024?
Yeah, well, the primary driver is no surprise. It's the burning of fossil fuels.
Right.
Your coal, your oil, your gas.
Yeah.
And this releases greenhouse gases, which, as you know, trap heat in the atmosphere and cause the planet to warm. It's a direct consequence
Of human activities.
Exactly, human activities, which means it's something we can change.
Right. And that's a point I think a lot of people kind of forget or don't really fully grasp. This isn't some inevitable fate. Our actions are driving this.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just us this time.
Right.
2024 also had some significant natural events that kind of
Yeah, for sure.
added fuel to the fire, so to speak.
Yeah, we had an El Nino event.
Right.
And that's a natural climate pattern that warms the Central Pacific Ocean, and it influences weather patterns all across the globe.
Oh, wow.
So that definitely had an impact on the overall warming trend.
So it was kind of like a double whammy almost.
Yeah, sorry.
With our actions and then this El Nino on top of it.
Yeah, and then you mentioned the undersea volcanic eruption back in 2022.
Right. It almost seems counterintuitive.
Yeah.
But didn't that actually have a cooling effect on the planet for a while?
It did, and it's pretty fascinating how that works. The eruption released this huge amount of particles and water vapor into the atmosphere, and those particles and that water vapor acted like a sort of temporary shield, reflecting some of the sun's energy back into space. So yeah, it had a cooling effect, but it was really short-lived, and it didn't offset the long-term warming that's driven by,
Our actions.
Yeah, by human activities.
Right. So we've got this complex interplay of human-caused and natural factors at play here.
Mm-hmm.
But let's get down to the nitty-gritty here. What are the tangible consequences of all of this?
Mm-hmm.
We're not just talking about some future threat, right? We're seeing the impacts of this right now.
Yeah, unfortunately, the effects are unfolding all around us right now. I mean, just think back to 2024. Think about those devastating wildfires in California, Bolivia, Venezuela. And then you had those torrential floods that ravaged Nepal, Sudan, Spain, deadly heat waves in Mexico and Saudi Arabia. And these are just a few examples. I mean, extreme weather events are becoming much more frequent and much more intense because of climate change.
And the financial cost, I mean, just the sheer cost of this is
unbelievable. Staggering. I mean, our sources mentioned something like $140 billion in global losses from climate-related disasters just in 2024.
That's the third highest amount ever recorded.
It's hard to even fathom that number. It really hits home that climate change isn't just this environmental problem, it's an economic problem.
Oh, absolutely. And these costs are almost certainly just going to keep rising unless we take some really serious action to mitigate climate change.
Mm-hmm.
But speaking of these interconnected systems, we were talking about that earlier. There's another factor that often gets overlooked when we talk about these extreme weather events, and that's water vapor.
Okay, now this is where I need a little extra help. I know water vapor plays a role, but how exactly does it tie into this whole warming scenario?
So basically, a hotter atmosphere can hold more moisture.
Okay.
And more moisture means more intense rainfall, which then leads to more powerful storms.
Okay.
And guess what? 2024 saw record high levels of atmospheric water vapor. So that likely contributed to some of those extreme weather events we were just talking about. Wow. Okay, I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together. And for anyone listening, think back to any unusual or intense storms you might have experienced recently in your own region.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that these changes are happening all around us.
Exactly. And it's a perfect example of how interconnected these climate systems are. A rise in global temperature, it has a cascading effect on everything from weather patterns to ocean currents.
So with all this in mind, it's easy to feel kind of overwhelmed, you know.
Yeah.
But before we spiral into despair here, is there is there any hope? What about the Paris Agreement? Does exceeding that 1.5-degree limit mean it's just irrelevant now?
I wouldn't say it's irrelevant.
Okay.
Not at all, actually. The Paris Agreement's far from irrelevant. Even though we've exceeded that 1.5-degree limit, even if it's just temporary, it still provides this really important framework
Yeah.
for international cooperation on climate action. Countries really need to stay committed to their pledges, to reduce emissions and to adapt to a changing climate.
It's almost like a roadmap,
Yeah.
guiding us toward a less catastrophic future. And there is some good news coming up, right?
Yeah.
Climate models predict that 2025 might actually be a little bit cooler thanks to La Nina,
Right.
which is, the cool phase of that El Nino Southern Oscillation cycle we talked about before.
Exactly. Yeah, that's true. It is true, but it's important to keep in mind that this is probably just a short reprieve.
Okay.
La Nina doesn't just magically erase the underlying trend of global warming.
Right.
Think of it like a little dip on a roller coaster. The overall trajectory is still upwards.
That's a good way to put it. And that brings us to another kind of concerning factor. Rising ocean heat content.
Mm-hmm.
I know that the ocean absorbs a huge amount of the excess heat that's trapped by greenhouse gases.
Yeah.
But what does that actually mean for us?
This is really important, and it's something that people don't talk about enough. While that absorption by the ocean does help to buffer us from, more rapid atmospheric warming in the short term, it has some pretty serious long-term consequences.
Oh.
We're talking sea level rise disruptions to marine ecosystems and potentially even more powerful storms.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because warmer oceans, they fuel those storms.
So it's like a delayed reaction almost.
Yeah.
Like the ocean's absorbing all this heat now, but it's going to release it back into the atmosphere eventually and just further contribute to warming down the line.
Exactly. And what's particularly worrying is that ocean heat content is rising at an accelerating rate.
Oh, no.
So this could indicate that global warming itself is accelerating, which makes the need for action even more urgent.
Right. Okay. So we've kind of painted a pretty bleak picture of the climate challenge here.
Yeah.
But let's just shift gears a little bit and talk about solutions, because while the situation is serious, it's not hopeless, right?
Mm-hmm. No, it's not hopeless.
What can we actually do to mitigate this future warming and adapt to the changes that are already happening?
You're right. We can't just give in to despair. There are things we can do, both individually and collectively.
Okay.
We need what I call a two-pronged approach: mitigation and adaptation.
Okay.
Mitigation focuses on reducing those greenhouse gas emissions to slow down the pace of climate change.
Okay.
And adaptation is about adjusting to the impacts that are already happening and preparing for future ones.
So mitigation's about preventing further warming, and then adaptation's about learning to live with the changes that are already here.
That's a good way to put it, yeah. And we need both. It's not an either situation.
Right.
We have to do everything we can to limit further warming while at the same time preparing for those impacts that are now unavoidable.
Okay, so let's start with mitigation. What are some of the key strategies for reducing those greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, the biggest thing, the most impactful thing is to transition away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy sources.
Right.
Things like solar, wind, geothermal. And it's a huge undertaking,
Yeah.
but it's absolutely essential to decarbonize our energy systems.
Yeah. And this is where I think individual actions can make a difference, right?
Yeah.
Like choosing to power our homes with renewable energy, or opting for a public transportation, or driving more fuel-efficient vehicles.
Absolutely. Every little bit counts. But it's also really important to remember that we also need systemic change.
Right.
We need government policies
Yeah.
and investments at all levels to support this transition to a cleaner energy future.
So it's a combination of individual action and large-scale systemic change. What about other mitigation strategies? We hear a lot about forests these days and how important they are.
Yeah, forests are amazing. They're what we call carbon sinks, which means they absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which helps to mitigate climate change. So protecting existing forests and planting new trees, those are vital strategies. You can almost think of them like these giant air
Oh,
purifiers
that's a great,
constantly
yeah.
working to remove that harmful carbon dioxide from the atmosphere.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Huh.
So we've got renewable energy, we've got energy efficiency, and we've got forests. Those are some pretty big levers to pull.
Mhm.
But what about adaptation? How do we actually adjust to the impacts of climate change that are already happening?
Adaptation strategies have to be tailored to the specific risks and vulnerabilities of each region.
Right.
So, for example, developing drought-resistant crops is really important in areas that are prone to drought.
Right.
Building seawalls can protect coastal communities from rising sea levels. Improving early warning systems for extreme weather events can save
So
lives.
it's about being proactive and preparing for the changes that are coming our way, not just reacting after the fact.
Exactly. And it's also about building resilience, being able to bounce back from climate shocks and stresses.
Okay.
This means, stronger infrastructure, more diverse food systems, robust social safety nets. We need to create societies that can withstand the inevitable impacts of climate change.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about recognizing that climate change is a reality that we need to adapt to while at the same time working to prevent the worst case scenarios. But this isn't just a local problem, is it?
No.
This requires international cooperation.
Absolutely. Climate change is a global problem that demands global solutions. The Paris Agreement is a good example of this. It provides a framework for countries to work together to reduce emissions, to share knowledge, and to support each other in adapting to climate change.
It's a reminder that we're all in this together,
Mhm.
and while there are definitely challenges ahead, it's encouraging to see, people around the world working together to address this shared threat.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Climate action isn't just about governments and corporations. It's about individuals, communities, civil society organizations, all coming together to demand change and to create solutions.
It's like a collective effort. It's a global movement.
Mm.
But let's bring it back to our listeners here, especially those preparing for the UPSC exams. How does all of this tie into their studies?
Well, for those aspiring civil servants, understanding these complex dynamics of climate change is absolutely essential.
Right.
You'll need to be able to analyze policies, assess risks, and propose solutions that are both effective and equitable.
So it's about being part of the solution,
Hmm.
about using your knowledge and skills to help navigate this challenging landscape.
Yeah,
Speaking of navigating, we've covered a lot of ground in this second part of our deep dive.
we have.
We explored the causes and the consequences of climate change, but we also talked about those solutions and adaptations
Hmm.
that offer, a glimmer of hope for the future.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating discussion. We've examined the science, the impacts, and the potential solutions to climate change. But now I want to leave our listeners with a final thought as we wrap up this critical topic. So if we spent this whole episode exploring, all the ins and outs of climate change, the causes, the consequences, the potential solutions, the adaptations, but ultimately the question is, what are we going to do with this knowledge?
That's a powerful question.
Hmm.
It really puts the responsibility back on each of us, doesn't it?
Hmm.
Knowing is one thing, but acting on that knowledge, that's what really matters.
You got it. Knowledge without action is meaningless. We can't afford to just sit back and be passive observers. We all have a role to play,
Right.
whether it's making changes in our own lives, advocating for policy changes, supporting organizations that are working on climate solutions. Every action counts.
So it's not about feeling overwhelmed or powerless. It's about channeling that knowledge into action, no matter how big or small.
Exactly. Remember, even small actions can have a ripple effect. When we choose to live more sustainably, we inspire others to do the same. When we speak up about climate change, we raise awareness and we create momentum for change. And when we support those organizations that are working on the front lines, well, we're contributing to the collective effort to build a better future.
It's a good reminder that we're not alone in this.
Mm.
There's a growing global movement of people who are committed to climate action.
And that's where the real hope lies. In the collective power of individuals, communities, businesses, governments, all working together to address this challenge.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We explored those complex realities of climate change,
Mm.
but we also highlighted the solutions and the potential for a more sustainable future.
It's been a great conversation. I hope our listeners feel, informed and empowered and inspired to take action. Remember, knowledge is power, but only when we use it to create positive change.
And on that note, if you enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. Stay tuned for more insightful discussions on critical topics that matter. Until next time, keep diving deep.